3 weeks ago, the Duke of Marbury did the most shocking thing London society had seen in a generation. He passed over every celebrated beauty of the season and chose Lady Charlotte Ashby, the quiet one, the plain one, the elder sister no one had ever looked at twice. Tonight was meant to be her triumph, her engagement ball. 200 candles, 300 guests, and for the first time in her life, every eye in the room turned toward her. And then her own sister stood up. In front of all of them, the dowagers, the rivals, the Duke himself, Lydia Ashby raised her glass, and with a voice that carried to every corner of that gilded room, she said the words that would end her sister's life as she knew it. Charlotte stood frozen as the whisper became a roar. The woman who had finally been chosen, disgraced in a single sentence by the one person in the world who shared her blood. Every soul in that ballroom knew exactly what came next. A duke does not marry a scandal. He would set down his glass, turn on his heel, and leave her standing in the wreckage. That is what dukes do. That is what everyone expected. The Duke of Marbury rose from his chair, and he did the one thing not a single person in that room, least of all the sister who had just betrayed her, ever saw coming. But to understand what he did, you have to understand why a sister would destroy the person she loved most in the world. Because Lydia Ashby was not jealous. Lydia Ashby was terrified, and the secret she was protecting that night would not stay buried for long. Stay with me. To understand tonight, we have to go back 3 weeks, to the moment the Duke of Marbury broke every rule London had. The Ashby family was old, respectable, and quietly drowning. Their father, Sir Edmund Ashby, had died 11 months earlier, and he had left behind 2 daughters, a crumbling townhouse, and a name that still opened doors, though fewer every season, and he had left behind a problem with no solution. 2 daughters to marry, and almost nothing to marry them with. Everyone agreed on one thing. If either Ashby girl was going to save the family, it would be Lydia. Lydia was 19, golden-haired and luminous, the kind of beautiful that rearranged a room. When Lydia laughed, men forgot what they were saying. When Lydia entered a ballroom, mothers tightened their grip on their sons. And Charlotte? Charlotte was 4 and 20, dark-haired, watchful, quiet, the sort of woman people described as sensible, which, in that world, was almost an insult. She had spent her whole life in the warm shadow her sister cast, and she had made a kind of peace with it. Someone had to manage the household accounts. Someone had to remember the servants' names. Someone had to be the one who noticed things. So, when the Duke of Marbury, Adrian Hale, one of the wealthiest, coldest, most sought-after men in England, began to attend the same dull parties as the Ashby sisters, every soul in London assumed he had come for Lydia. Every soul was wrong, because the Duke had already noticed something about the elder sister that no one else in 6 seasons had ever bothered to see. And it had nothing to do with her face. It had happened at the Hartwell garden party 2 weeks before the ball, a crush of people, lemonade and small talk, Lydia at the center of a laughing crowd, as always, and Charlotte at the edge of it, as always, half forgotten by a hedge. The Duke of Marbury stood alone near the roses, watching the whole performance with the flat, bored expression that had earned him his reputation. Cold Marbury. They said he had never once laughed in public. They said he chose his words the way a banker counts coins. And he watched as a small disaster unfolded at the edge of the lawn. An elderly woman, Lady Pemberton, half blind, leaning on a cane, caught her foot on the uneven grass and went down hard, her teacup shattering, her reticule spilling across the path. 300 people were at that party. 299 of them looked away. A fallen old woman is an embarrassment. One does not stare. One person crossed the lawn at a near run. Charlotte was on her knees in the grass before anyone else had moved, gathering the old woman's things, steadying her, speaking to her low and calm, shielding her from the watching crowd with the angle of her own body, so the woman would not feel the weight of all those eyes. She did not look around to see if anyone was watching. She did not know that one person was. And here is the part that matters. Charlotte never knew the Duke saw her that day. She would not learn it for weeks. When she finally did, it would change how she understood everything that happened to her. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The Duke of Marbury watched a woman the entire world overlooked kneel in the dirt for someone who could do nothing for her and ask for nothing in return. and the coldest man in England felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt curiosity. 3 days later, his carriage stopped outside the Ashby townhouse. The household nearly fainted. Lydia was summoned, dressed in record time, arranged in the drawing room like a flower for display. The Duke walked past her. "Lady Charlotte," he said, "if she is at home." You could have heard a pin drop in 3 counties. Charlotte came down in her plain gray day dress, ink on her fingers from the household ledgers, utterly bewildered. And the Duke of Marbury, who had reduced ambitious mothers to silence and made debutantes weep with a single raised eyebrow, stood in that shabby drawing room and asked her, with no romance and no flattery, to be his wife. Charlotte, to her eternal credit, did not swoon. She looked at him for a long moment and said, "Why?" A duke had just offered her everything, a title, a fortune, an escape from the slow ruin swallowing her family. And her first word was why. The duke's mouth moved, just slightly, the closest thing to a smile anyone had seen from him in years. "Because," he said, "you are the only person I have met in a very long time who does the right thing when she believes no one is looking, and I find I would rather like to know what that is like to live beside." It should have been the beginning of a fairy tale, and for 3 weeks it almost was. But somewhere across London that very night, a man named Silas Crane heard the news of the engagement, and he began very quietly to smile. Because Silas Crane had been waiting a long time for the Ashby family to have something left worth taking. Now, before we go any further, I have to tell you about Lydia, because by the end of tonight, you are going to hate her, and then, if I do my job right, you are going to feel terrible for hating her. On the surface, Lydia took the news beautifully. She embraced her sister. She wept happy tears. She declared it the most romantic thing she had ever heard. But Charlotte, who had spent her whole life noticing things, noticed something. Her sister had started to disappear. Small absences at first, an afternoon unaccounted for. A note that arrived and was quickly burned. Lydia, who had never in her life been able to keep a secret for more than an hour, had suddenly grown careful, watchful. There were shadows under her eyes that powder could not quite hide. One night, Charlotte found her sister sitting alone in the dark parlor, not crying, just staring at nothing. "Lydia," she said gently, "what's wrong? You can tell me anything. You know that." And Lydia turned to her with a smile so bright and so brittle it frightened her. "Nothing is wrong, Lottie," she said. "I'm simply so happy for you, I can hardly bear it." It was the first lie Lydia had ever told her sister. It would not be the last. Hold that image, the bright, brittle smile in the dark, because in about 20 minutes you were going to understand exactly what was behind it. And it is so much worse than jealousy. So, who was Silas Crane? Crane was new money and old resentment, a self-made shipping magnate, enormously wealthy, and utterly shut out of the one thing money could not buy him, the acceptance of the people who had been born to it. They took his loans, they attended his dinners, and behind their fans they called him a grocer in a good coat. 2 years earlier, Crane had set his sights on a respectable old name to launder his ambition. He had chosen the Ashbys, and he had made an offer for the elder daughter, for Charlotte. And Charlotte, sensible, overlooked, supposedly grateful Charlotte, had looked Silas Crane in the eye and refused him, politely, firmly, completely. No one had ever refused Silas Crane and made him feel it the way she had. He had smiled and bowed and left, and he had never, for one single day, forgotten it. Crane was a patient man. He knew the Ashbys were sinking. He knew that sooner or later, desperation would bring them back to his door. What he did not expect was that the Duke of Marbury would reach them first. And so, Silas Crane did what men like Crane always do. He stopped waiting for a weakness, and he went looking for one. He found it in the one place the Ashby family thought was safely buried, in a dead man's papers. Here is what Sir Edmund Ashby took to his grave. The family was not merely poor. It was poor because Sir Edmund, in his final desperate years, had done something unforgivable. To keep the family afloat, to keep his daughters fed and clothed and marriageable, he had forged the signatures of 2 business partners on a set of loans. He had used a name that was not his to use. It had kept them alive. And it was, very simply, a crime. The kind of crime that did not die with the man who committed it. If it came to light, the consequences would not stop at scandal. The Ashby name would be destroyed beyond any recovery. The debts would be called in. The house would be seized. And the two daughters of a proven forger would be cast so far out of society that no respectable man, certainly no duke, would ever be permitted near them again. Sir Edmund had hidden the evidence, but he had not destroyed it. And 11 months after his death, those papers found their way, through a bribed former clerk, through patient and expensive digging, into the hands of Silas Crane. The most dangerous thing in England is a patient man who has been made to feel small, holding the one secret that can unmake the people who did it. Now, I want you to put yourself in Lydia's shoes. 19 years old. Her sister about to marry a duke, the one thing that could finally lift the whole family out of the dark forever. And a knock comes at the door from a man holding a letter that could send her dead father's name to the gallows and throw both sisters into the gutter. What would you have done? Crane came to Lydia. Not Charlotte. Lydia. He chose the younger sister because he understood something about her that even she did not fully understand about herself, that beneath all that golden, laughing confidence, Lydia was the more frightened of the two, and frightened people are easier to move. He laid the forged papers on the table in front of her, in a private room, and he let her read them. He watched the color drain from her face, and then he told her his price. It was not money. Crane had money. His price was Charlotte. The engagement to Marbury will end, Crane told her, calm as a man ordering dinner. Publicly, soon, by your hand. The Duke will be made to let her go, and your sister will be made to understand that she has no future in his world. And when the dust has settled and the proud Lady Charlotte has nowhere left to turn, he smiled, she will remember that I once offered her my name, and this time she will be grateful for it. And if I refuse, Lydia whispered. Crane gathered the papers. Then I publish these by week's end. Your father hangs in memory and in law. Your home is taken, and you and your sister spend the rest of your lives as the disgraced daughters of a common criminal. The choice, my dear, is entirely yours. So now you understand the impossible thing Lydia was holding. To save her sister, she had to destroy her sister. To protect Charlotte from total ruin, she had to break Charlotte's heart and call down a smaller scandal to bury a fatal one. And she could tell no one, because Crane had promised that the moment Charlotte learned the truth, the moment the Duke was told, the papers would burn the family that same night. Lydia had to be hated, alone, with no one ever knowing why, and she chose to do it. Which brings us back to the ballroom. 200 candles, 300 guests. Charlotte in the first beautiful gown she had ever owned, pale silver, chosen by the Duke himself, standing at the side of the man who had, against all the world, chosen her. For 1 hour, it was everything she had never let herself dream of. The Duke stayed close. He was not a warm man, but he was an attentive one, and Charlotte was beginning to learn the difference. When a sneering dowager made a cutting remark about the elder Miss Ashby's sudden good fortune, the Duke turned his cold gaze on the woman until she physically stepped backward. He said nothing. He did not have to. Charlotte caught his eye, and for the first time, she smiled at him without fear, and across the room, by the tall windows, her sister Lydia watched them, and made the bravest, most terrible decision of her young life. She had spent 3 weeks looking for another way out. There was no other way out. Crane's deadline was tomorrow. It had to be tonight. It had to be public. It had to be her. Lydia took a glass of champagne from a passing tray. Her hand was perfectly steady. That was the part that would haunt her later. How steady her hand was, in the worst moment of her life. She stepped up onto the low dais where the musicians played, and she tapped her glass for silence. 300 faces turned, and Charlotte, sweet, unsuspecting Charlotte, felt a flush of warmth because she thought her beloved little sister was about to toast her happiness in front of all of London. She was about to learn what it feels like when the person you trust most in the world drives a knife straight through your heart to save your life. Lydia's voice rang out, bright and clear and carrying. My lords, my ladies, before this engagement goes one moment further, there is something all of you deserve to know about my sister. The room went still. Charlotte's smile froze on her face. Charlotte has always been the clever one, Lydia went on, and she made the word sound like an accusation. so very clever. Clever enough to make a duke believe she is something she is not. But I cannot stand here in silence and let this good man bind his great name to a woman who has deceived him. A gasp moved through the crowd, like wind through wheat. "Lydia," Charlotte breathed. "What are you—" "She does not love you, your grace." Lydia turned to the duke, her chin high, her eyes glittering with what the whole room read as triumph, and what was, in truth, the look of a girl shattering herself on purpose. "She told me so herself. She laughed about it. She said she would marry your title and your money and feel nothing for the cold, joyless man attached to them. I have heard her mock you. I have heard her. And I will not let my own sister make a fool of a man in front of all society." It was a lie. Every word of it was a lie, and Lydia delivered it flawlessly, because she had to make it land, because a half-hearted betrayal would not be enough to satisfy Crane. And so, she made it total. The ballroom erupted. Charlotte stood at the center of 300 people, the silver gown suddenly feeling like a costume, like a joke, as the whispers rose into open murmurs of, "Did you hear?" And the elder one, of course, what did he expect? And a duke, marrying that, scheming little. For one heartbeat, Charlotte stood at the center of 300 people and felt the whole world tilt. And then the part of her that had spent a lifetime noticing things, noticing which fires were lit, which servants were unpaid, which silences meant trouble, that part of her began, even now, to work. She looked at her sister, really looked, the way only she ever did, and she saw it. The hand around the champagne glass, too steady, far too steady for a girl whose whole body was trembling underneath. The chin lifted high, but the eyes wrong, glassed, fixed on a point above the crowd because they could not bear to land on Charlotte's face. The shadows under them, that 3 weeks of powder, had not quite hidden. The brittle, breaking brightness Charlotte had been watching grow for a month and could not explain. This was not triumph. Charlotte had grown up beside every one of her sister's true cruelties, the small, careless, happy ones a vain girl commits without a second thought. This was nothing like those. This was a girl reciting words that were killing her to say, "Something is wrong. Something is so terribly wrong, and she cannot tell me what." And in that instant, Charlotte Ashby made a choice, the most important of her life, and she made it in front of 300 people who were waiting to watch her, either crumble or fight back. She did neither. She stepped forward, not away from Lydia, but toward her. She put herself between her trembling sister and the merciless eyes of the room, and in a voice that shook but did not break, she said, "My sister is unwell." The murmuring faltered. "She has not been herself in weeks, and I have been too wrapped up in my own happiness to see it." Charlotte lifted her chin to the crowd, taking the full weight of every stare onto her own back, so that none of it could fall on Lydia. Whatever she believes she has to say tonight, whatever has frightened her into saying it, she is my sister, and I will not stand here and let you tear her apart for sport. The fault, if there is one, is mine. Look at me. It was the single most ruinous thing she could have done. She had just declined to defend herself. She had publicly taken the blame for her own humiliation rather than expose the sister who had caused it. Any sensible woman would have denounced Lydia and saved the engagement. Charlotte chose her sister instead, when everyone was looking. And Lydia, who had braced for hatred, who had needed her sister's hatred to make the sacrifice bearable, looked at Charlotte shielding her and made a small broken sound, and the flawless mask began, at the edges, to crack. Everyone in that room knew what came next. The Duke would protect his name. He would leave. Charlotte braced herself for the sound of his footsteps walking away. Instead, she heard the scrape of his chair. The Duke of Marbury stood up, and the reason he stood, the thing that moved him at last, was not the accusation. It was what he had just watched Charlotte do in answer to it. He did not look at Charlotte. He did not look at the gasping crowd. He looked at Lydia for a long, long moment, and his cold gray eyes were not angry. They were knowing. "Miss Lydia Ashby," the Duke said, and though he did not raise his voice, the entire ballroom fell silent to hear it. "That was very well done. You nearly convinced even me, and you have, I think, just proven yourself the bravest person in this room." A confused murmur. This was not the script. This was not how the scene was meant to go. The Duke turned at last to the crowd. And the coldest man in England did the one thing no one, not the dowagers, not the rivals, not Crane waiting smugly at home for his news, and least of all the sister who had just damned herself, ever saw coming. He defended her by telling the truth, all of it. "You came here tonight," he said to the room, "to enjoy a scandal. Allow me to give you a better one. I am aware that the Ashby family is in difficulty. I have been aware of it since before I ever asked for Charlotte's hand. I know about the debts. I know about the papers her late father signed that were not his to sign." Another gasp, sharper now. "Yes, I know about that too. I have known for some time." Charlotte swayed on her feet. "I also know," the Duke continued, his voice like iron now, "that there is a man in this city who has gotten hold of those papers, and who has been using them this very fortnight to terrorize a 19-year-old girl into doing exactly what you all just watched her do." The silence in that ballroom was total. "I do not know yet," the Duke said softly, "whether Miss Lydia chose to humiliate her sister out of malice or out of love. But I find I can guess, because no one performs a cruelty that flawless unless their heart is breaking while they do it." He paused. "And because I have just watched the woman she ruined refuse to save herself in order to shield the sister who ruined her. Families that love like that do not betray one another for spite. I would stake my name on it. In fact," his eyes swept the room, cold and certain, "I just did." And he turned and he looked at Lydia. And for the first time that entire night, the girl's perfect, brittle composure cracked straight down the middle, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, and she began, silently, to weep. In one breath, the Duke of Marbury had done something extraordinary. Think about it. The only weapon Silas Crane had was a secret, and the Duke had just said it out loud, to 300 of the biggest gossips in England. A secret screamed across a ballroom is not a secret anymore. In a single sentence, he had taken Crane's loaded pistol and emptied it onto the floor. But the Duke was not finished. He walked, slowly, deliberately, to the center of the room, to where Charlotte stood, frozen and trembling and utterly lost. He took her hand. "Lady Charlotte," he said, and now his voice gentled in a way no one present had ever heard from him. "I owe you an apology. I knew the danger your family was in, and I chose not to frighten you with it. I believed I could protect you quietly. I was wrong. I should have trusted you with the truth, because you, of all people, have never once flinched from it." "You knew," Charlotte whispered, "all of it? Before I asked you to marry me?" "Yes." His thumb moved once across her knuckles. "I told you why I chose you. I meant it. A title can be inherited and a fortune can be stolen, but the thing you have, the thing your sister has, underneath all that fear, cannot be bought at any price. I am not marrying the Ashby name, Charlotte. I never was. Let it fall. I am marrying you." And then, in front of all of London, the Duke of Marbury raised Lady Charlotte Ashby's hand to his lips. The ballroom did not gasp this time. The ballroom, that cynical, glittering, merciless ballroom, actually, against all its instincts, began to applaud. But you and I both know this is not over. Because somewhere across London, Silas Crane was still sitting by his fire, still holding those papers, still expecting a very different ending to this night. And a cornered, humiliated man with one weapon left is the most dangerous creature of all. The Duke had defanged the secret, but he had not yet dealt with the snake. Silas Crane's defeat took exactly one morning. He woke to find his great secret shouted across half the peerage, his blackmail turned inside out, and the Duke of Marbury's solicitors already at his door. Because the moment a secret is screamed across a ballroom, the blackmailer stops holding a weapon and starts holding a confession. Every threatening note Crane had ever sent Lydia was now simply evidence. His crime in his own hand. The Duke offered one cold sentence through his solicitor: leave England by month's end and never speak the Ashby name again, or be prosecuted for extortion to the full and ruinous limit of the law. Patient, proud, self-made. Silas Crane was on a ship before the month was out. London never saw him again. And the forged papers? The Duke quietly made the old debts good himself, settled them honorably with the wrong partners, and buried Sir Edmund's worst mistake for good. This time in the hands of someone with the power to keep it buried. He did it without being asked. Charlotte only learned of it months later, by which point she had stopped being surprised by him. The villain was gone in a single paragraph, which is exactly what villains deserve. But the story wasn't over, because the hardest thing still hadn't been mended, and it had nothing to do with dukes or blackmail or society at all. The hardest reconciliation was not with society. It was between two sisters. For days after the ball, Charlotte could not look at Lydia, and Lydia could not stop weeping, and the house was thick with everything that had not yet been said. It was Charlotte who broke first. Of course it was. She was always the one who noticed when something needed mending. She found her sister in the dark parlor, the same chair, the same brittle place, and she sat down beside her, and she said very quietly, "You did it to save me." "I did it because I was a coward," Lydia choked. "I should have found another way. I should have trusted you. I should have told you. He would have burned us all that same night. You knew that? You stood up in front of 300 people, and you let them all believe you were a monster, so that I could live." Charlotte's voice shook. "Lydia, look at me. That is the bravest thing anyone has ever done for me, and I spent 3 days hating you for it, and I will never forgive myself for that." And the two sisters, the golden one and the overlooked one, the one the world adored and the one the world ignored, held onto each other in the dark and wept, and something that had nearly been broken forever was, slowly, made whole. Lydia, by the way, married 2 years later, for love and for nothing else, because her sister the Duchess made very sure she would never again have to trade her heart for her family's safety. But that is a story for another night. 1 year later, Charlotte Hale, Duchess of Marbury, stood at the window of a great warm house watching the snow fall, with her husband's arms around her. She had grown into the title in a way that astonished everyone. Everyone, that is, except the man who had chosen her precisely because he had seen what she was before anyone else bothered to look. "You never did tell me," she said, "how you knew, that night, how you were so certain." Lydia was being forced. The Duke was quiet for a moment. "Because I had already seen what your family is made of," he said. "I saw it in a garden a year ago, when a woman everyone else ignored knelt in the dirt to help a stranger who could do nothing for her." He turned her gently to face him. "People who love the way your family loves do not betray each other for sport, Charlotte. They only ever do it to protect each other. I simply had to ask myself what your sister was so frightened of. The rest was easy." Charlotte looked at the cold, exacting, impossible man she had somehow been given, the man the whole world called heartless. And she understood, at last, the joke of it. The coldest man in England had turned out to have the only eyes in London warm enough to actually see her. "Why are you smiling?" he asked. "Because," she said, "you are the only person I have ever met who does the right thing when he believes no one is looking." And the Duke of Marbury, who never laughed in public, laughed just for her, where no one else could hear. So, here is what I want you to take with you tonight. The whole world looked at those two sisters and saw the obvious story, the beautiful one and the plain one, the favorite and the forgotten. And when the scandal came, the whole world was certain they understood it. Jealousy, betrayal, a sister's spite. The whole world was wrong about everything. Because the loudest, ugliest moment is almost never the true one. The cruelest thing a person does is sometimes the most loving thing they could find a way to do. And the people the world overlooks, the quiet ones, the ones kneeling in the dirt where no one is watching, are so often the ones holding everyone else together. There was only one person in that ballroom who refused to believe the easy, ugly story, who looked at a cruelty and asked, but why? Who chose to see the frightened girl behind the flawless lie? And that is the whole secret, not the blackmail, not the title, not the fortune. The secret is this: anyone can judge what a moment looks like. It takes someone rare to ask what it actually is. Be the person who asks why. Be the one who looks twice. Because the people worth loving in this life are almost never the ones standing in the brightest light. They're the ones in the shadow at the edge of the room, waiting, quietly, for someone with the eyes to finally see them. If Charlotte and Lydia's story moved you tonight, do something for me. Tell me in the comments. Did you guess why Lydia really did it? And which sister did you find yourself rooting for? I read every single one. And if you believe the quiet ones deserve their happy ending too, subscribe and turn on the bell, so the next story finds its way to you. Your next one is already waiting.